Halfway towards an unprecedented triple-dip recession. Britain's economy shrank in the fourth quarter last year and by much more than expected, according to figures today from the Office for National Statistics. I'm joined now by Joe Grice, he's Chief Economist at the ONS. Well, Joe, a surprise to say the least, and the biggest driver was a 10.2% collapse in mining and quarry output. That's the biggest fall since records began.
Well, that's something we sort of expected. We knew that the normal maintenance on the largest of the North Sea oil fields, Buzzard I think it's called, that was extensive and later than usually would have happened for various reasons. So that led to a sharp fall in that area and probably contributed something like 0.2 of the overall fall in GDP.
But that's something that's not expected to be repeated in Q1 this year.
Exactly right. That looks like a genuine special effect. And there is a further special effect in the figures insofar as we didn't have the Olympics in the fourth quarter in the way that we clearly did in the third. So things like ticket sales, which would have been included in the third quarter, didn't get included in the fourth.
So taking those two elements into account, what you're suggesting then, if I may interpret, is that the underlying picture might not be as bad.
Well, certainly both of those would be factors, one-off factors which would take us in a downwards direction. If you take those into account, then probably you've got an economy which has not really broken away from the path we've seen now for a little while of a sluggish economy on a slightly bumpy path. If you actually look at 2012 as a whole, in fact, as compared to 2011, no change. And
well, it doesn't get much flatter than that.
And equally, if you look at the fourth quarter this year, 2012 as against 2011, again, no change. So some up, some downs in the interim, but on the whole, an economy which still looks pretty flattish.
But the economy, if we take the last 5 years since the 2008 peak, is 3.3% smaller now than it was then. This shows that Britain is performing much worse than many of its international peers. Why is that?
Well, it's certainly interesting. Look at that period. We had a sharp decline, as you remember, in 2008. Peak, I think, was the first quarter of 2008. Then something of a recovery, and then something of a flattening out. So we've now recovered about half the total fall from the peak. On the other hand, if you look at the sectors, then you've got quite a differential performance. The service sector, that's about 70% of the economy, is now back more or less to where we were immediately before the recession. So most of the recovery in the service sector is taking place. But in the non-service sectors, manufacturing, production, construction, that hasn't done as well.
And that's despite the large stimulus from the lower exchange rate?
Well, certainly it doesn't seem to have been reflected in the figures for those sectors.
You mentioned services. The last 5 years, it may have recovered much of the lost ground, but in Q4 specifically, it was flat. And
yes.
Why the weakness there?
Well, as always with that sector, it's a big sector, nearly 3/4 of the economy, quite differential performance in different sectors. So transport and communication, for example, that was up 0.7, distribution down 0.4, government and other services down 0.7. But that's where the effect of the Olympic ticket sales would have been. Mm-hmm. So that has to be taken into account as well. Now,
the Treasury is pinning this performance on two items, essentially the weak performance of Europe and the Eurozone and the previous debts piled up. The debts piled up by the previous government. I know you don't want to get into the politics of it, but is this reflected in the numbers, in the stats that you're seeing?
Well, as you say, I don't want to get mixed up in the politics of it, but what we have seen is a trade balance which continues to be fairly adverse, and maybe that's been part of the reason that the manufacturing sector has been pretty affected. Manufacturing as part of production actually down 1.5% this quarter.
Talking of trade deficits, obviously they're detrimental to the overall GDP number. But is there a sign that foreign demand for our goods is falling off? What I'm trying to say is, are there inventories being piled up in warehouses around the country just because our overseas buyers are not buying them?
Well, we don't get any information at this stage for the fourth quarter. All we've got is the overall output measures. But it certainly is the case. I was saying earlier that manufacturing does seem to have done rather worse over the last few years than the service sector. And I think that's one of the areas that is worthwhile looking at.
But why is it doing badly? Is it because of lack of demand or because of something else?
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting set of issues, and one which actually I think does deserve further attention. But we haven't got any extra information about that today, but certainly an area which could stand some analysis and some investigation.
We'll have you back on to talk about that in the future. Joe, thanks very much. That was Joe Grice of the ONS. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.